I forgot to ask you that. Okay, all good.
Okay, so over to me, is it?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay, good morning, everyone. We finally got here. It's usually me that stuffs up technically, so I'm feeling quite smug, really. I was on time with everything working. But anyway, sorry, Lisa. I'm just by way of introduction. First of all, I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in St Peters in Sydney, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm a mental health accredited social worker. Started my working life 42 years ago as a residential youth worker for the Anglican Church. Then I was a hospital social worker for 11 years, and for the last 31 years I've been in private practice, and pretty much specialising in working with lawyers, but occasionally I lash out and work with other people, and doing a lot of training around this area of vicarious trauma and resilience and so forth with the pandemic in the last couple of years. The way this goes is that I'm going to, we'll go through the slides. If you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself and come on and do so. If you put it in the chat, I'll get Lisa to check it in the chat and let me know someone's there. And there's about 3 logical places to stop on the way through so we can check how it's going. And then we'll get rid of the slides at the end, and happy to take whatever discussion and questions you want to have then. And you've got the slides with the references on them that you can have after the workshop. And the other warning I should give at this point in time is that the first part of this workshop is depressing while we discuss what the vicarious trauma looks like and how stress affects our brain, and I'll fix it in the second part. So bear with me in the first part while we identify what it looks like. Alrighty. So first of all, what is this thing called vicarious trauma? And simply put, it's the trauma we get from someone else's trauma. And it took us a while to work out how this happened, but we actually now know through the brain science that our brains develop the ability to imagine what's happening to someone else as they tell it to us, or we hear about it from someone else, or we watch it happening to someone else. And it triggers our own fear center as a result of that, in case it could happen to us. And it gives us the same fight, flight, fright that the person who's going through the hard time is getting, which is a very physiological response from our brain, where it pumps a lot of chemicals through our system to get us ready to meet a threat. But it's the threat that's happening to the other person, not to us. But our brain doesn't actually make the distinction between the two. And Baroness Susan Greenfield, one of the world's leading neuroscience, says the thought is the same as the activity to the brain. So you think it, you talk about it, you read it in a file, you see it happening to someone else, your brain goes, uh-oh, that could be me, and turns on the fear center, which was originally meant to last for about 3 minutes because our fear center arrived to help us deal with a lion situation. And I'm reliably told by, I can't remember who, that your stress situation with the lion's over in about 3 minutes. Either way, you're not stressed anymore. So all that fight, flight, fright stuff is good because it either helps you stand very still and impersonate a tree, or it makes you faint so you don't feel what's happening to you, or it makes you run, which will get you eaten. Either way, that settles the situation. But what's happened in our brains over time is that we've developed extra prefrontal cortex area, this bit right behind our eyes here. And we've developed really good memory, which logs memory all around the brain quite successfully, and the ability to worry about what's going to happen next. So one bad thing happening makes us think about the next bad thing happening. And so we keep firing the chemicals for all the things that have happened as we remember them, have dreams about them, talk about them, and then we can even anticipate the next ones. And then that makes us fire our fear center about those, even though they haven't happened yet. So does that make sense so far? Does that kind of make sense to people? Yeah. Okay. Now we've actually known about it for longer than you would think. And actually it was Viktor Frankl, who was the Holocaust survivor, who was also a psychiatrist, that sent a team of his researchers to interview his fellow Holocaust survivors immediately after the war. And by the time that team finished taking the stories of the survivors, they had worse symptoms than the survivors did. And it really comes down to numbers. Because of that thought, it's the same as activity to the brain. Day in, day out, you're facing this, your brain keeps firing these chemicals, keeps giving you things to remember and worry about, keeps making you aware of what's happening to people. Then your brain stays alarmed and stays worried about these things, which kind of makes sense, I guess. They didn't do anything about it at that point. And then we fast forward to the Vietnam War and the Vietnam veterans coming back with their symptoms, and they funded research into themselves, and we got post-traumatic stress disorder up as a diagnosis at that point. And one of those guys, a guy called Charles Figley, started to investigate what happens to the people who are looking after the people who are suffering. And it's basically his book called Compassion Fatigue, which we're using as a textbook for today, written in 1995 before we had the brain science, but still a really useful document, not the least of which because it helps us think about how the organisation should operate, what should happen in teams, and then individual strategies, which is what we're going to look at today. Okay, so in terms of workplaces, emergency services got it first, and then eventually medical settings got it. And the law has just discovered this as something recently. And I've just run this training with every court in New South Wales, every court, every judge in the Pan Pacific, and every judge in New Zealand's just recently been through this training. So we're finally catching up with the fact that the work affects our stress levels. However, those of you who've been warriors in this field and been looking after children and their families for a long time, you build up ways of dealing with it. Some of them are constructive and some of them maybe not so. But what can happen to more experienced workers is that there's a straw that breaks the camel's back situation. So you may have dealt with a lot of things over time, and then there's one that gets to you. And it's because of all the others that came before that this one's hurting more than the others have. And we also have always known what's been consistent in the research all along is that things happening to children affect people more than anything else. So children in suffering and pain and dying is one of the leading causes of vicarious trauma because it just affects our whole sense of safety and fairness in the world. And we really don't like to see children suffer, and we feel helpless in the face of it. But as I said, we find ways to deal with it over a long career, and then one gets to us. And so I want to, that's why we'll go through the symptoms. So you might identify them in yourselves and also so that you can identify them in each other. And then I want to talk about proactive strategies to keep you well doing this work so that we don't get that straw that breaks the camel's back situation. The example of that that really highlighted this for me amongst the magistrates and judges recently was one of our magistrates came down with a screaming case of this a few years ago. David Halpern, his name is, while he was doing a sitting on a multiple child sexual assault case at just the time he'd become a grandfather. And it was being granddad that made the work suddenly more relevant to him personally. And that's when all his defences failed him at that point. But he'd been 20, 30 years getting to that spot, just hadn't realised it until this final one. So does that make sense still to everyone? Any thoughts or questions about any of that? No? Shall we venture into the murky territory of identifying the symptoms, which is always dangerous to do, but let's see how we go. Now, they're the same as the post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, but about the other people's stories and what's happening to them. I always think the first one's rather badly named because it sounds like a lot more fun than it actually is. But the hyperarousal is literally the fight, flight, fright that I described that's chemically induced by your brain into your body, where you get cortisol pumping into your system just to stop your pancreas turning sugar into insulin and keeping it as sugar, so you've got something, you've got fuel. And it also goes down and coats your nerve endings so that if the lion bites you, you won't bleed so badly. That's not good in your system for a long time. All of your hypertensive stuff is up, adrenaline is pumping through it huge amounts, and it's what affects your memory, which we'll get to. All designed, as I said, to meet a 3-minute threat, but when it's part of what you do for a living, then it keeps pumping and it starts to become a problem. So that's when we can get grumpy with this. We can have trouble sleeping. We can be dreaming and having nightmares. We can have a startle effect about things that wouldn't worry us, or we get paranoid about things that didn't worry us before. I've got some really good examples of some of this. After all my years working in emergency departments with children and dealing with both cot deaths and drownings, I'm still left all these years later with symptoms that bother my family hugely. So say around the drowning stuff, I had about 15 of those in a couple of years. At the time I had toddler nieces, and my brother put a backyard pool in, didn't he? So it's still a joke in the family today that my reaction at the time, if they asked me if they could have a swim when I was minding them, was, oh, do you have to? And they go, yeah, it's really hot. Okay, 15 floaties on every limb. And we've got an enduring image of the older one literally bouncing on the top of the pool saying, "But I can't get wet, Auntie Robyn." And me going, "Excellent, that's the only safe way to do this. Can I have a bath?" "No, you drown in those too. Stand there, I'll hose you." Much safer. I note that my younger niece's reaction to that is to get her toddler into a pool as quickly as possible and get her swimming, to get over what trauma I gave her as a result of that. I also did 33 cot deaths in about 3 years. I'm still not good in a house with a sleeping baby. I've now got great niece and great nephew. If they're asleep when I get there, I do whatever I can to make a noise so that they wake up when I'm there, which again does not endear me to my niece at all. So there are a couple of my versions of overreactions to things and enduring paranoias I have that I didn't have before I did that kind of work. It can lead to a sense of never doing enough. And that is one of the things that can cause burnout. And burnout's very closely aligned with this, because if we keep working harder to try and help people more, then we burn ourselves out, and that's a real problem. The cousin of that first lot is hypoarousal, where because of that, we're starting to get tired now. We try and block off some empathy from some situations because we don't want to be hurt by them. And we have trouble getting the routine parts of the job done. So we don't want to go to meetings, we don't want to discuss stuff, we don't want to do statistics, we don't want to do any of that. We also can be withdrawing from colleagues and from friends and family if we're not careful. And so then we get isolated, which is a real risk. Those two can alternate a bit confusingly. And then running through, once our brain's alarmed, it starts to try and avoid the things that it knows is going to distress us. So particularly around, when we're dealing with children, when they're sick and when prognosis is coming along, it gets harder to spend time with them, or we don't want to spend time with anyone else. We just want to spend time with them. And then we start forgetting other things like meetings and where we're supposed to be, walk into a room, forget what we've walked in there for. Memories are real, something that really suffers in this context. And then because this is very physical, then we start to get somatic disturbances from it. Our immune system gets lowered because our brains acquired the energy to do the fight, flight, and fright. And these chemicals building up in our system fill our joints, make us ache, linked with arthritis, headaches, tiredness, and we start to have minor accidents because we're literally not watching where we're going. And now we're catching everything else that's going around. And so it starts to become a physical health issue. I told you this part was cheerful. I'll see if anybody's identifying with any of it shortly. And then finally, the psychological symptoms start to kick in and our worldview starts to change. We start to see in my business victims and perpetrators everywhere. We worry about our own kids with the slightest illness. We get protective, or we can get addicted to the busyness and the stress, and we can be doing extra work outside work. And again, that burnout issue comes into play there. But it also can make us indifferent to the needs of the ones at home because the people at work are sicker. So we can all, that turns into relationship problems that really can leave us out in the cold and not very well supported. So that's the whole nasty lot of symptoms. How does that go down with anybody? Does that make sense to anybody? Anybody want to join me in some paranoid behaviors you have? Or are you going to leave me out there looking weird? Can people relate to some of that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, cool. Okay. All righty. So the thing to say about all that is that that's normal. If you don't have reactions to the suffering of children, you're a psychopath. So you're supposed to be distressed by it. You're supposed to try and find ways to deal with it. It's the nature of the work, not a problem with the worker. So keeping that in mind is really important. And then I'm going to add to what can help the positioning around that so that it can actually work for you, that you acknowledge that you're doing really important work and are willing to step in and try and do this. Okay, so of course, being around distressed people and distressed colleagues, then sometimes it can take us a while to notice that we might be in some difficulty with this. And in the case of the magistrate, I mentioned his wife had been telling him for 6 months. But when he looked to his fellow magistrates to see whether he was any different to them, he couldn't see any difference because they all had it too, but didn't know. So listen to your people at home, listen to your friends and family. If they're telling you that the work is starting to affect you, ask them what they're seeing, and don't snap at them and tell them that everything's all right, because they're your canaries in the mine, and listen to people who care about you that are giving that feedback. And just another tip you might use to identify things yourself, if when you get home from work, pets and children are running the other direction, you've gone too far in the cutting your emotions and killing your empathy, and you need to do something about it. Pets and children are supposed to run towards you when you get home. So that might be a way you can tell how you're traveling in the space. All right, so let's have a look at what Figley's idea was that could be done about it. And as I mentioned, he had a three-pronged approach, if you like, what the workplace can do, how we can support each other in the workplace, and then individual strategies. So that's the way we'll go. And the first one is actually, it took a long time to get over if it's too hot in the kitchen, get out kind of mentality. So people felt they had to pretend that the work wasn't affecting them, or hide their symptoms, or think there was something wrong with them if the work started to distress them, or they got accused of being over-involved and not having good professional boundaries and those kinds of things. I'm hoping that we're almost past that now, and certainly there's plenty of evidence that we now, and across a lot of workplaces, are understanding it's the nature of the work and not a problem with the worker. And then once we've recognised that, then the workplace needs to think about what it's going to put in place to help deal with that, and it has some obligations here. So, and traditionally these things are things like providing, I've put the word supervision there, which is what psychologists and social workers do. I'm required to meet with someone on a regular basis. In my case, it's a peer supervisor, because there's no one left older than me anyway. And I meet with him at least 10 times a year. He works in the sexual assault area. And we check each other for our vicarious trauma. We discuss the strategies and what we're doing for wellbeing. We keep our learning up so that we keep across our brief and we can do the job. And we're required to do that as part of how we function. And I have had experience in the past where I've run those kinds of sessions with medical teams and with nursing teams when I was working at St George Hospital. And a lot of the legal areas now are starting to do this. But use whatever supervisory relationships you've already got in the workplace to put vicarious trauma and the nature of the work on the agenda. Ask people how they're traveling in the work. Bring it up in your sessions and in team meetings. Talk about what you're doing about it as individuals and team members to deal with it, and make it part of the normal conversation, like you would any other review, and just make it part of how we think about doing the work. The other kinds of supportive relationships that are helpful are mentoring relationships, and we actually know from the brain science that mentoring someone else is actually better for the brain of the mentor than the mentee. So a really good thing you can do is look after those coming into the role, help them put things in place, and have someone that you're keeping an eye on, whilst at the same time hopefully having someone that keeps an eye on you, and that's probably the best place to be. And then, because the work is so triggering, and particularly again around children's illnesses and children suffering and children dying, sometimes it triggers us sufficiently, or things happen in our own life that we actually need counselling about it. And having regular access to counselling through EAP, thinking about talking to your own GP about it, and lining up a regular counsellor that you might see on a few times a year, just on a check-in basis, like you would for your GP kind of stuff. But the sooner we can, if it unearths personal stuff, the sooner we can get to talk to somebody about it and learn how to manage those triggers and put some defense things in place, then the less harm it can cause. So I actually suggest we need all of those levels of support when you're doing the kind of work that you're doing. The other side of it is training, and it's really interesting that Figley was ahead of his time here. He knew that if you got people doing this work, training, thinking about it, writing about it, and teaching it, then that's actually a way of clearing up the distress. And there's actually an approach to the brain science called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, who's an English psychiatrist, who's reconfigured all of the mental illnesses as those coming from right brain and from left brain. And along with Dan Siegel, the guy that's the children's specialist and teenage specialist, talks about the benefit of whole brain. So the fight, flight, fright comes from right brain, comes from our emotions. It's primal, doesn't have much language. Learning, discussing, teaching, writing about it comes from left brain. And that gets us into what we call whole brain, so we're aware of the distress, but now we've got plans in place, we're learning. And also as we're learning and discussing, we're pumping myelin into that prefrontal neocortex area, which helps the synaptic connections get stronger and helps them make more connections. So Figley was ahead of his time in understanding that we needed to learn, think and strategize as a way to deal with this rather than just vent and rather than do the old debriefing side of things. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the other side of it is to just notice that you're doing a really important job well, and you're doing it on behalf of the children and their families and the rest of the community. And Judith Herman talks about the importance of bearing witness. She's one of the great trauma specialists going back to the 60s and 70s. And she says that if someone knows what if somebody else knows what a person has gone through in their trauma and their distress, that person bears witness to what's happening to them, that in and of itself is helpful to the child and the family. So being prepared to be in the space and know what's happening to people and support them should make you proud and should actually help you continue to do the role, which actually prefigures what Martin Seligman has described as post-traumatic growth. That if you recognize you do a difficult job well for the sake of others, that turns it from a job into a calling, and that can turn the stress, the post-traumatic stress, into post-traumatic growth. And again, because you learn skills to be able to do that, you can be proud of it, you're doing it for other people, and the constant recognition that that's what you're doing and that's what each other is doing is a really powerful antidote to the post-traumatic stress disorder, and can in fact turn it into post-traumatic growth and have you up for dealing with all sorts of things in life that you wouldn't have been because of the work you do. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, and the brain science seems to back this up. So it's really important that you value the work, your colleagues and the clients. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Leave the screen alone. I'm just trying to move the slides. Right, does that make sense to people?
Yeah.
Yep. Any thoughts or comments? No? Okay. So coming down the next slide, a few more things the workplace can do. We do know that the risk of vicarious trauma goes up when workloads go up. Now, it's impossible to, my experience of hospitals and medical settings is that you get clusters of things going wrong with people and you lose a group rather than an individual. You can't control that in medical settings. So learning to ride the ebbs when they're there and deal with the flows is really important. And thinking about making sure people aren't doing too many shifts, that the roles being shared, that there is some facility for rotation of duties into a less frontline position, if that's possible for part of the time, and making sure that certainly the people are taking their breaks and having their weekends and their evenings and those kinds of things. Pushing through leads to burnout and all of the other health problems that I indicated at the beginning. And also to make sure that there are some avenues in the workplace to be able to do some debriefing and diffusing. But I actually want to put a warning in about that. The initial response in medical settings in particular was to get together and talk about this stuff, but it became venting rather than a helpful conversation. And remember, I've already said the thought is the same as the activity to the brain. And what Viktor Frankl's research also showed was that there are two kinds of people in the world. There are emoters and there are repressors. And emoters like to talk about what's distressing them, feel some benefit from doing so, and want to offload all the time. And repressors don't find that useful and tend to be the ones that are quiet and aren't talking about it. So they tend to be the ones that the emoters seek out to talk to about what's disturbing them. And so the repressor's getting a download from their colleague with no reciprocal place for it to go because they don't talk about what's distressing them. Teams tend to be a mixture. You've partnered the other, by the way. Two emoters don't get together because no one hears the question. And two repressors don't get together because no one asks the question. And it's a perfectly sensible arrangement to have one talker, one listener in a couple relationship. Drives you nuts later, doesn't it? You like the fact that he was quiet because you could talk and he listened. Now he won't tell you how he's feeling. He's driving you nuts. I've just done a terrible sexist generalization there, but you know what I mean. And teams are usually a mixture, as I said. So let me make a few suggestions here. Emoters, could I suggest you seek informed consent? Before you download on your colleague, say something like, I've had a really bad morning, can I offload on you? And then I need you repressors, because it's the repressors you've gone to have this conversation. I need you to go, actually, I've had 4 of you this morning. Could you try the repressor down the hall, please? Better yet, use each other to remind yourself how to get to EAP or your counsellor of what you've got in place. So yes, do say to a colleague, I'm feeling distressed. All of you have the phone numbers for where assistance can be got in the organisation, and then assist that person to get to a pair of paid ears to talk to about it, because the paid ears won't get injured because they've got strategies and training in place to listen to it, and they won't have the same triggers. And only talk with a purpose. Once you've understood the source of the distress, the conversation should quickly move to, what do we do about it? Does it need a change of procedure? Do we need to get back to a family? Do we need to change what happens in that area? Do we need to approach it differently next time? And once you get to the decision part of the process, where you've understood it better, then stop talking about it. Because the neuroscientists have come up with this brilliant term called neural kindling. Every time you talk about it without fixing it, you put another log on the fire of the distress in your own brain and the brain of the listener. And I really like that image. So we want to actually put the fire out. The more you talk about it without acknowledging it and having a plan come out of it, the worse you're making the problem, both for yourself and whoever has to listen to you. So think of neural kindling and talk with a purpose. And once you've got that purpose achieved, then stop talking about that particular incident and get on with the work from there. Okay, so that's the first loss. Does that make sense to people? Comments about that? Anybody identify themselves as an emoter or a repressor?
Yes. You're both. Can you be both?
Well, you can, and you can alternate in and out of them at different times, actually. I think I definitely started out as a clear off emoter, and I've become a hermit these days. Don't want to have these conversations. Have to use the supervision ones and remind myself it's my duty to do it. So yeah, I think it can change across a working life, and it can also change depending on what's going on in your own life and how many people perhaps you're having to listen to in your personal life might affect it as well. Okay, any thoughts or questions about anything else I've said so far? Are we making any kind of sense at all?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, cool. All right. Well, let's move to the next level of what should happen in teams. So just coming down this one. And this really comes down to keeping really good relationships between yourselves as your baseline. Whilst we're talking about the particular stresses of vicarious trauma in your role, actually the thing that's most injuring in Australian workplaces is unintentional bullying that happens as a result of people's stress. So if we don't manage our own stress, then we snap at others, or we isolate ourselves from others, and then we start to get injured and injure those around us. And in fact, that magistrate that I've mentioned a couple of times, Magistrate Halpin, and I have his permission to discuss this, I witnessed the extraordinary thing of him giving an apology to the entire Aboriginal legal service for New South Wales and the ACT for his behaviour during the time he was undiagnosed with his vicarious trauma. And he realised in hindsight that it had been making him snap at people, and that he just wanted to get off the bench and didn't want to be around it and didn't want to be discussing it. Any delay, anything that went wrong, he was rude about and had a go at people. And it was all a part of his vicarious trauma. And in his words, he was offering that by way of explanation, not an excuse. But we can become the unintentional bully if we don't manage our own stress. So there's two things, reasons I'm saying that. So managing your own stress and putting some of these things I'm about to suggest in place is really important, so you don't become the unintentional bully. And on the other side, if you've received a cop from a colleague that's not normally that way, put it down to this on the first instance, let it cool down, and then approach them and ask them if they're okay. Don't respond to unintentional bullying through an official process if you haven't checked that it isn't this first. And be forgiving of each other and give each other some space in that area. And that's why pre-existing really good relationships with each other is really important. And that's one of the things that COVID has made difficult, and not being able to spend time as we would have in the past and so on. Do nurture your relationships. Do get on screens if you're not physically seeing your colleagues. Shift work can bugger this up as well. Pre-existing good relationships, really important. And as I mentioned earlier, use the times you are together to check how everybody is traveling. And leaders, if you found a recent situation with one of your families really difficult and it has distressed you, bring that up. You go and get counselling yourself. You use EAP. You tell your team that's what you're doing, and then everyone else will be more likely to do that. So lead by example, and be willing to have this conversation. And the old kind of medical nurse stoicism, I'm all right, I can cope with anything, needs to go. Otherwise you don't get assistance, and then you end up in a really distressed state and nobody knew because you weren't able to have the conversation. What I do know nurses to be really good at is fun in the workplace, and prioritising humour and fun, not the nasty old cynical black humour stuff that used to happen when I was in emergency rooms that seemed really funny at the time, but was actually really had a quite nasty edge to it. But learning to laugh is really important, and laughing with each other is one of the best things to keep the team working well, and it's the great stress reliever. Laughter actually releases the stress from your system, and they reckon actually that a good belly laugh is the best way to go. So I'm personally working on the theory, the bigger the belly, the better the relief of the laughter. Works for me. Obviously not at people suffering, but at the silly things that happen all the time. And actually that just comes to mind. I've been spending some time with a family recently who I worked with years ago when they lost their child in very tragic circumstances. And that first night, because the mother was injured and was in hospital as well, and something, I believe from memory, somebody in intensive care dropped a bedpan, and the whole distressed family just cracked up laughing. And I've got a memory in my mind of the mum who had an injury from the same incident and had been to surgery that day, holding her bandaged head after brain surgery, saying, "Robyn, why are we laughing?" I said, "Oh, it beats what we've been doing the rest of the day, I guess." And she said, "That'll do." So we kept laughing. And over the following months, in a very difficult situation, we laughed at a lot of things. And she said to me then, "I don't know, I still don't really get why we're laughing. And I certainly don't know how we're laughing, but I'm really glad we've been able to, because it's the thing that got us through." And she recognised from the very beginning that a healthy sense of humour, even in the saddest of situations, can be really helpful. And certainly for colleagues, a good laugh together, really important thing. I start by looking in the mirror in the morning. That gets me laughing, and then we go from there, really. And there's plenty of things that can happen in a day that can put a smile on your face. All right. And also the other stresses that happen in the workplace, particularly at the moment, particularly in COVID, with all of the regulation changes, all of the behavioural changes in the workplace, managing change well is really important to staying well in this space. So if any of you have perfectionist tendencies, and you'll all look at each other when I say that at this point, you will have been really struggling in COVID anyway. You're in the wrong area of work, can I suggest, if to stay well. And could I get you to turn your perfectionism into constructive perfectionism, or what a guy called Tal Ben-Shahar calls optimalism, which is 80% all the time without killing yourself. And you will release a huge amount of energy. You will be easier to work with. You'll be better able to support, and you'll learn from your mistakes. That reference is called The Pursuit of Perfect by Tal Ben-Shahar. You can find an online or audio version, and he'll guide you through the steps to turn yourself into an optimalist. And he actually says, fail every day. It's the way you learn. It's not learning from failures or mistakes that's the problem. It's not making the mistake in the first place. So in a very imperfect system, that's sometimes very frustrating to work in terms of what it can offer children and families, we can get really stuck in trying to make it perfect when we actually just need to be making it good enough. And with the amount of change that's been inflicted on everyone recently, learning to go with the flow, and there's a whole lot of theory about that and there's the man with the unpronounceable. You've put slow into a search. I can't say his name. It's got too many consonants. Can't get my tongue around it. Mahaley something or other, 13 more letters. He actually came up with the idea of flow. We are less stressed when we're doing what we do, using our strengths, and we get into a way of doing it that makes sense. And the other thinking that's worth thinking about at this point in time is the slow movement. Do it slow, do it once is its thing. And that's a guy called Carl Honore. And sometimes in that adrenaline rush makes us rush around doing everything, makes us rush decisions, makes us do the procedure without thinking about it. And then it enhances our ability to make a mistake. Whereas if we actually slow down, did it right the first time, then that lowers anxiety and lowers the brain firing the fear center. So they're all things that can hopefully help in terms of positioning yourself. And just on this level, then gratitude turns out to be a really helpful thing. Be grateful for what is working. And if you go to Martin Seligman's workplace, Authentic Happiness, www.authentichappiness.com, and get some ideas for how to be grateful every day. So be grateful for staff for doing an extra shift. Be grateful for the things that did work today. If people helped you, thank them personally. Write gratitude journals and remind yourself what others have done for you. It actually changes your brain chemistry, changes your mood, and works as a really good antidote to the stress, because it makes you focus on what's working and that people are helping you rather than on the mess. So the science is really solid on that, is that there's a really strong physiological improvement from being willfully grateful. And it actually makes your brain look for what's working, which it doesn't naturally do. It's got a natural bias for what went wrong. So gratitude's a way to address that. Really important that we're grateful to all those around us who help us get there and do the job. Okay, I might pause at that point. That's the general positioning stuff about what should happen in a workplace. Any other thoughts or comments to that? There's one in chat, I think. Lisa, can you see what that is?
It was just Rochelle helped us out here. It was just a presentation thing.
Okay, cool.
So that's all good. Rob, can you just touch a little bit more on the debrief process? I know you talked about it, and I think in the conversation we had, you talked about what you should do individually from the kind of emotional, psychological components versus what you could do in a team, being the more process components when you.
Yeah. Well, so there's been a big debate around the benefits and the harms of debriefing in groups. And I've actually personally come to the conclusion that the harms in a group situation outweigh doing it, because what happens in a group situation is you hear what distressed the other person, which might not have been the aspect of the situation that distressed you, but now you're thinking about that. I think debriefing has got far more hazards in a group. Now, the way I run, I do, however, still run a kind of debriefing model in some of my legal settings, but we structure it. So we start it with what's been going on, check in, what's been happening, what are the issues for people, what are people experiencing, and then we go to strategy immediately from the group, and then we check out at the end of it where we've got a decision about how we're going to do something differently by the end of that conversation. So any group discussion has to have that structure, and one that brings you through to now I'm going to do this in my practice after this discussion. And again, you stop talking about that particular situation then. Same structure can apply in an individual one. But obviously, if what's happening in the individual situation is it's your reaction that's being dealt with, and it's not being tainted by everybody else's. Because the other thing that can happen is this weird thing called survivor guilt. And you might have been through a situation and traveled through it quite well. And then you come out of one of these group things thinking, well, I'm not so upset about that. What's wrong with me? Or I didn't get that. And, we can start to do a comparison thing, which isn't helpful. So in a one-on-one, that whole risk is taken out. But both kinds of conversations need to end up with thinking about it and strategizing moving forward, rather than the ongoing discussion about it. So there may be merit to do a group debrief, but group debriefs, therefore, in my opinion, should be optional. People should be able to opt into them and come if they wish. And guarantee your emoters will turn up to that, no problem. And your repressors will be very reluctant to come. So we need to up, and I'm going to talk at the end about individual strategies that repressors can do when they're not talking. But even repressors, if you have been distressed by a situation and you know you have been, then you do need to talk to someone to help put into words what's going on for you and get that strategy happening. So it might be EAP, or your appointed mentor or coach, or even your GP. And just tell them enough don't go into gory details, but just tell them enough about what you're worried about yourself that you're needing help with, so that you can then get strategies to deal with that. Did that make any sense at all, Lisa?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Any other thoughts or questions at this point? You're all repressors, or you're making me do the work. That's all right. That's what I'm being paid for. Okay, so I'm just trying to work out which slide I'm on here, being too clever. So I won't do this in great detail, but the other part of supporting others in the workplace, really what I say about this is make checking in with each other about how you're traveling, doing the work, a part of your normal conversation. Don't just concentrate on broken protocols, what went wrong, work pressure stuff. Bring up in every kind of work meeting you're having with each other at every level. Ask your supervisor how they're traveling at the moment, particularly if you know something sad has recently happened. Supervisors ask your team how they're traveling. Ask each other as peers, but bring vicarious trauma and stress management into every discussion that you're having. It's not an addition to the other procedures you do. It's essential to doing this work safely. If you're aware that something is distressing, what's the worst aspect of it for you at the moment? How are you managing it? And then again, moving quickly to what strategies they need to add, and remembering to look for the job well done, even though it was difficult. I've actually had situations where the most extreme I can think of was an AMBO who was triggered dealing with the death of a child because of his own experience. But his version of events was he just lost it and he didn't deal with it very well at all. But when he spoke to, because basically he disassociated, but his mate, I was able to say to him, no, mate, you actually did the job really well. The family didn't notice. You did everything you needed to do for them. And if that was going on, well, good on you. You did much better than you think. So giving the feedback about what's been done well, what the intentions were, really important. Getting the person, particularly the perfectionist, who never feels it was good enough, to go back and notice that they've done a difficult job as well as they could, and what have they learnt from it, and what might they do next time. Now we're back into that whole brain where we've got left brain happening, and we're constantly evolving how we practice and how we do the work as a result of it. Also in this conversation and just generally, notice changes in demeanour and attitude over time. And people can go fairly quickly into being withdrawn. They're not talking in meetings the way they used to be. They're talking about patients or relatives in a way they wouldn't have in the past. And just note those things as early warning signs and bring them up with each other. Someone else will notice you doing it before you do. And so again, pre-existing good relationships where you feel like you can bring things up with each other is really important. Now there's actually a resource on the, I have a fair bit to do with the UK Bar. The UK Bar's got a Wellbeing resource, which doesn't need to be for lawyers. If you go to www.wellbeingatthebar, I think I've got this reference at the end, .org.uk, type in barrister needing help or clerk needing help. Clearly you don't need to be other. And then type in vicarious trauma. There's a checklist there that you can get some resources off, but also type in, how do I help a colleague? And we've actually got some scripted conversations about how to ask a colleague you're concerned about to start that conversation. So if you're a bit unsure in that area, there are resources to help you, but let's learn how to have these conversations with each other and pick up on those changes in demeanour and attitude, because they're the early warning signs. And if we can get them early, then people can return to their normal status. And again, back to my magistrate, his wife had been telling him for 6 months. If he'd listened to his missus about how he'd been behaving, and got the help 6 months before, he wouldn't have had the breakdown that he had. So value colleagues and family members who are willing to tell you that they think you're not travelling so well. Ask them what they've seen, and then get to the assistance that you need, and be willing to ask those questions of colleagues. Also, it is okay in this space, because of the nature of the work, we tend to blame the work for all of the stresses and all things people are going through. But in the meantime, while you're doing this job, you're raising your own kids, you've got flatmates to deal with, you're having relationship breakups, you're getting married, you're doing all sorts of things. And even good things happening in your personal life can become a trigger for the work suddenly. So again, back to my favourite magistrate, a good life event, becoming a granddad for the first time, was what made him vulnerable suddenly doing the work, because now he was identifying with his personal little ones at home, with the bad things that were happening to the little ones in his court. So getting married, breaking up, your own kids being sick, all sorts of things caring for an elderly relative whilst having to do this job. So it is okay to check if anything's changed at home, to see if that might be what's made the vulnerability happen. And then obviously what needs to happen about that, then that can be further taken up in a clinical discussion with a counsellor or clinician that can help sort out what might need to happen there. Also be aware that your work affects the work of your family, and a lot of the places that are now putting services in place for staff are offering counselling for family members too. And you might want to think about that through your EAP. You take it home. And even if you're not talking about it, you take your mood and your distress and your sadness home sometimes. And someone's having to deal with that. So it might be worth thinking about, what kind of service you can offer for those that you're living with, so that they get the support they need. They can come with you to a session if that's needed. Again, they get early intervention so that people aren't suffering at home. Okay. All right. So that's the whole what you all should do for each other thing. Just another pause there. That all making sense still? Questions? Okay, so individual strategies to finish with. Now, this may sound stupid, but I'm calling it the power of choice. Working with the legal profession, you chose to do this role. You might be wondering why on earth you did, and there may be many days you do, but you can unchoose it. You don't have to keep doing this work forever if you find that it is getting too much for you. I think you actually need to develop an attitude of I'm enjoying the challenge and enjoying the work at the moment, but ask yourself at least twice every year how you'd feel about still doing this role in 2 years' time. And if your heart sinks in response to that question, you might want to be thinking about an alternative. Now, whether that's you go into a more admin role in the organisation, or a teaching role, if that's possible, or you take a break, or you deploy some long service leave if you have it, or you go off and work in another area for a while, which I notice a lot of my immigration lawyers are doing. They're taking sabbaticals fairly regularly. They'll do 2 years in the immigration stuff. It'll all start to get too much for them, but they still have the passion and want to do the work. They'll go into academia, they'll take a break, they'll go do a less demanding role for a period of time, and then they'll come back when their batteries are charged. So think about how you build in breaks, how you check it, and actually a break is a way to check how you're feeling about the work. If you're in another role for a while, or in a secondment, and you're missing the role, then you're not done yet. But if you're dreading going back to your regular role, then you probably are. Use holidays the same way. Start to notice every year about how you feel in that week before you come back to work. And if you're really dragging yourself to come back to work, then that's a problem. I'll come back to holidays in a minute. Okay. We don't want you to kill your empathy either. So just that little bit of distancing of naming the family or the child in your own mind who's going through the situation. It's theirs. You're going through it with them, but it's not happening to you. And learning to get over that survivor guilt idea and be grateful that it hasn't happened to you if it hasn't. If it has, be aware that it's their story now. And by actually making it their story in your mind, it doesn't affect you as much. It helps give you that distance that that the brain isn't giving you by firing the fear center. And again, I can't stress enough, being proud of doing a difficult role well, and being aware that what you're doing is really important to the children and the families you're working with. So remembering that is really important. without getting arrogant about it, obviously. And again, that empathy test, pets and children are running the other way when you get home. You've killed your empathy a little bit too much and you need to bring it back. I guess I think I've made the point. Get yourself supported by every direction you possibly can. So whether you informally do it through getting mentors and mentoring others, whether you go the way that the legal profession is starting to do of getting clinical supervisors to work with staff the same way they do with psychologists and social workers, and keep learning and training in the role, learning new ways to do it, pumps that myelin, like I mentioned. A competent brain deals with situations much more easily than a brain that's in alarm and feeling like it's not up for it. So view any training they throw at you, not just on this subject, but how to do the role better. Go for it. Even computer training is good for your brain. Go figure. But the more your brain learns and the more competent it feels, then you've got more defenses about the distressing side of the work. And the more you do it with others and you assist others in that learning, all the better. Keep reading, thinking, and learning in your practice and learning different things. The grief space is changing, and there's a woman called Mary Suarez is worth a look at in terms of children's grief and working with children and working with what happens to children. If you haven't come across her, she's another kind of new thinker in the grief space that would be helpful to have a look at. And again, the more ideas you got, the more models you're using, the better defended you are. And now make sure that, as I've been alluding to, that you are only working when you're supposed to be, that you formally take your workout off when you go home. If you're working remotely at the moment, then you'll have to divide your day up formally by going, okay, I'm in role now, and then I'm out of role. And there's a technique called the third space that can help you do that by Adam Fraser. If you go to www.dradamfraser.com, the third space is the thing you're doing now is the first space. The thing you're going to do next is the second space. And you consciously put a third space in between the two in which you reflect what's been going on there, anything else I need to do about it. You rest, do a mindfulness technique, have a stretch, look at the garden, and then you reset. Okay, what's next? And so you consciously bring your brain with you throughout the day. Definitely do it from the beginning of the working day and at the end of the working day. So you leave work there when you come home, and you leave home at work when you get there. If you're working at home, you change which part of your mind's in. You go out of domestic role into work role, and then consciously step back into domestic role. It's a brilliant little technique. Again, you'll find a link to it on that UK bar website I gave you, or if you just Google him in YouTube, there's a nice little animated version of it and him talking about how it works. Everybody I've got using it has found it really useful, and I hear it as a mindfulness technique, in a way to just have your mind where you need it while you're doing it. And I would also strongly recommend having a regular daily mindfulness practice so that you've got that to bring to bear on any triggers you might have. And I'll come to that in a minute. So make sure you're talking to people with happy, healthy kids outside work, that you have a mix of friends, some of whose eyes glaze over if you try and tell them about your job, because they'll make you change the subject. And don't just be hanging out with people doing heavy work all the time, because you'll just dig holes for each other. So consciously think about who's good for you, who raises your mood, who's good to be around, who's interested in you, and some hobbies and things that take your mind completely off the distressing stuff. So I note that a very controversial Charlie Teo, he's a mountain climber in his spare time, because when you're climbing mountains, you think about nothing but climbing mountains. It's as far away from brain surgery as you can get, and that works for him. So do make sure you take your breaks throughout a day, across a week, and your holidays. And Figley actually recommended 4 weeks annual leave in one go every year, predicated on the fact that that's how long it takes your brain to break down all the trauma chemicals, get them into your bloodstream and elsewhere, and get them out of you. So if you're not getting 4 weeks in one go on a regular basis, you're coming back subpar. Now, I know that's a hornet's nest, but I'm just telling you what the science is. But when you can get a longer break, take it. If you can't get a longer break, take your mind with you. Do not be doing work stuff. Do not be ringing in. Do not be looking at files. Have your brain elsewhere, and that'll give it a chance to revive. You've really got to take it away from it so it can recover. Okay, so just a few particular skills. accidental, I couldn't find I'm famous for saying put your work hat on when dealing with work. And the only picture I could find was a hard hat. So we're stuck with it. There you go. But consciously doing the work in role is your biggest protector. Reading files, listening to stories, listening to other people talk about it when you're not on duty is going to accidentally trigger you when you least expect it. Watching bad or sad movies about things happening to families is not a good idea. Think about what you're putting into your mind when you're not at work, and it should be wholesome, happy stuff. Role, uniform on, best way to stay protected against it. And again, you better, if you can manage it, to do short, intense periods of distressing work and then walk away from it and break it up with something more mundane. Now, you can't always do this, but where you can break up the time you're spending, do so. Certainly put breaks in if you can't get away from it over some days and weeks, and make sure that you're doing a mindfulness practice, therefore, every day to take your mind somewhere else. If you don't know anything about mindfulness and you're a bit skeptical, I refer you to Ruby Wax, the comedian, who has now got a master's in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy from Oxford University, of all places. And she writes the best books and has the best videos on how to quickly do a mindfulness practice. There's also Amy Saltzman that's got great mindfulness techniques for children. And mindfulness could really work with the patients as well. And if that's not already happening, that would be worth thinking of. And actually doing mindfulness techniques with them is going to help both of you. And doing mindfulness techniques with your kids at home can also be really helpful. So Amy Saltzman's, I think it's the Still Quiet Space or something like that, is her technique worth thinking about, and otherwise Ruby. The other thing that you can just tweak yourself throughout a working day and a distressing day is your own body posture. And we do know that body posture comes first, as does facial expression, and mood comes second. So obviously you don't do the work you're doing running around with a stupid grin on your face, but if you could try and make sure that your face is as neutral and as relaxed as possible while you're doing the work, that will stop your fear center from firing into more intense bad mood. That's Paul Ekman's work. And Anthony Damasio says your body posture is also crucial, and you're best to approach this work with a straight back so that enough air can get into your lungs and get up to your cortex. If it's possible to be up and moving around while you're having distressing conversations, that's even better. If that's not possible in doing the job, then as soon as you're able to come away from it, get up, stretch, break up those trauma chemicals and get them into your bloodstream so they can be sweated out. But body posture is really important, and slumping is not good for mood, and frowning is not good for mood. So if you can adjust those throughout a day, that will really help. And despite all of the above, you'll still get intrusive stuff come into your head. This is where your mindfulness practice will really help. You'll notice it quicker. And if you do get an intrusive thing, either in your day thinking or as a nightmare, and you realize that where it's come from, just actually go, oh yeah, that was that family the other day. Yeah, that was really sad. Is there anything I can do about it now? No. Okay. If there is, do it. File note, whatever. What would I rather be thinking of, and manually change your attention to something else. So whether it's a nice piece of music, whether you just want to do your breathing technique, whether you want to look at your garden, whether you want to play with a pet. Pets are really great mindfulness retuners. Then you take it off the negative manually and put it on the positive, and then you end up again with that whole brain situation. But practicing mindfulness on a regular basis will make that easier to do, so that you can use that when you do get intrusive stuff happening. That one didn't change for some reason. Let's try that one. Okay. And again, accept the feedback. If people are telling you that you're starting to get grumpy, or you're withdrawing, or you don't seem to be yourself, ask them what they've noticed, and then put the strategies that you're going to start to think about in place. Use your EAP, talk to your GP, talk to someone you know who's helpful to get you to change where you're at so you can be safer and well. And then you can do none of the above unless you look after your regular well-being regularly. And my experience is that nursing staff in particular are shit at that. Sorry, so I'm not good at that. So I'm not supposed to swear. Sorry, I apologise. So the basics. Now, this list I got from Candace Pert, which I think is the best author name for a book, Everything You Need to Know to Feel Good by Candy Pert, don't you think? The scientific book that she wrote about this is called The Molecules of Emotion, because she was a pharmacologist and a brain scientist. I'm speaking about her in the past tense because she died of a heart attack at 68, possibly diminishing her qualifications in the wellbeing space. But anyway, she did the science on this list, and chief among them is sleep. And if you're not sleeping well, you're not going to be able to do anything else I've mentioned today. So getting your sleep right is really important. Talk to your doctor about it if you're having serious problems with it. But there's all sorts of good resources called the Sleep Doctor, the Sleep Hygiene. I can't think of his name, but there's a guy called the Sleep Doctor. If you put him into a search, you'll get mattress ads and then you'll eventually find him. Few tips: go to bed same time every night, get up 8 hours later. Brain science is now saying adults need 8 hours sleep, predicated on the fact that it takes 4 hours for your brain to clear your organs out each night, which is one of the main reasons we do sleep, and another 4 hours to deal with your mind. So if you're even 20 minutes, half an hour under that several nights in a row, you're going to start to get under the pump. So good sleep hygiene, good sleep practice is really important. Develop the habit. Turn your screens off hours before you go to bed. Computer screens mimic the sun and mess with your circadian rhythms and make it hard for your brain to shut down. Only sleep with nice people in quiet rooms. Sleeping with nasty people does not help you sleep well. And I don't know how this will go down, but you should have had your last alcoholic drink by 5 p.m. if you want a good night's sleep. I'll just leave that with you. That's what the science says. Sleep is crucial. Obviously, diet. She's actually saying the more natural your diet, the better, the more organic, the more you know where it comes from, not the comfort stuff, the sugar and the chocolate and the alcohol that sometimes we go to in this state, which is where my brain goes anyway. I'm not sure about the rest of you. The more natural the food and the less of it in quantities, not big quantities, is recommended. We've mentioned mindfulness. Play is really important. Something happening in your life that engages you, that you enjoy. Legal and consenting with an adult, obviously. Play is actually joins all of your brain up and makes you creative and makes your brain relax. So something you do just for fun that is wholesome is really important. Sorry that exercise is still on this list. You've noticed I've been avoiding it. Tried really hard to get it off. Current recommendation is 5 hours across a week, not in one go. And if you're over a certain age and not fit, do not engage a personal trainer. They will kill you. They have no idea what unfit bodies can't do. Don't believe a young 30-something saying, yes, you can do it. No, you can't. Better to look at one called Slow, Fast, Long, by made famous in Norman George's books about particularly the brain's healing way, where you walk a short distance with other people slowly, first day, bit faster the next day. By the end of the week, you go as fast as you can, bigger distance next week, or put a hill in. So you bring fitness and stamina up with you and you don't injure yourself. Now you can cheat here too. If you mindfully exercise, you can get bigger bang for your exercise buck, and you will have just done your mindfulness. There's a swimming technique called total immersion swimming, where you just put your concentration on the part of the swim action that you're doing at that time. Shane Gould's got her own version of it. When she's swimming, she just puts a concentration on getting into the slipstream, because that's the part of swimming she loves the most. And of course, if she's in the slipstream, she's faster. So Shane is still the fastest swimmer in her age group in the world today, because when she's swimming, she's just swimming. So, and that's the essence of mindfulness. Plus you'll burn more kilojoules and get more muscle tone if you mindfully exercise. So even for 5 or 10 minutes of your normal exercise routine, get that feedback, count the steps, have your pedometers on, whatever way you get it, mindfully exercise, and then you get 2 for the price of 1. I'm always trying to help you cheat. Do make sure that your relationships, both at work and at home, are nurturing ones. You cannot do this work day in, day out if you're not cared for by others and you're not in safe relationships. And certainly the workplace, it's really important you keep your relationships respectful, safe and kind, like I've mentioned. And then you hang around with people out of work that have got your back, that like you, and that are going to treat you with kindness and respect. So really important to be connecting to others who'll have your back and who will care for you. And I've mentioned the gratitude practices. Again, look up Martin Seligman's website to get some ideas of those, but even journaling and writing letters to people is a good place to start there. And just keep in mind that choice. How long do you want to be doing it? Check in with yourself twice a year, use your leave, use long service leave as it comes along. Use your supportive relationships to check how you are feeling about doing the work, and give yourself the option of thinking about doing something else if you're not liking the answers to those questions. And really important, you put the oxygen on yourself first and on others second. So actually seeing all this stuff in the program today as part of how to do your job, not as additional to your job, will make you more likely to do it, and it will make you do your job better. So your self-care is essential in the role you're in. We know the role you're in has the risks because of the content that you're dealing with. So looking after yourself is the job, not additional to the job. So think about whether, if you're not already doing supervision conversations, how you could have them, connecting with your GP and all the stuff we've talked about to look after yourself. And do be aware that there are many of us who are very grateful for you doing this kind of work. You do it on behalf of all of us. You do it for the community. And there are many of us that are grateful. Just think of us. If you can't find the gratitude yourself in a day, be grateful to each other. But thank you very much for doing the kind of work you do, because it's so important, and so important to the families you're working with and the children you're dealing with. And it's really important to remember that. Okay, one slide to go, Liz, and then I'll shut up, which you'll all be greatly relieved about. There's the references which are on the slides. So there's Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Our textbook for today, if you like, The Compassion Fatigue, which came out in 1995. You can find it online. And there's a third trauma reference there about trauma stewardship, the idea of holding other people's pain as being such an important thing to value. And I've given you my favourite Ruby Wax book title for your mindfulness stuff, Mindfulness for the Frazzled, which I think is an excellent title. And we've actually been using her techniques throughout COVID with the federal court online. There's a little booklet of mine. Again, it's directed at lawyers, but you don't need to be lawyers for it to be helpful. On the Law Cover website there on that link, where I look at a lot of self-care stuff in a workplace and mental illness stuff. And there's a chapter on vicarious trauma in that. So you can download that as a free PDF, or you can use it to hyperlink to the references that I've talked about today. And that Wellbeing at the Bar resource, particularly around vicarious trauma and managing stress and talking to colleagues you're concerned about, they've got free PDFs you can just pull off the website to give yourself a script in certain situations. They've also linked to the mindfulness resources, certainly the Third Space, Ruby Wax, Adam Fraser are all there. So go read that. Remember, you just have to type in Barrister needing help or Clark needing help. And that last reference there is the magistrate I've been referring to, describing how his vicarious trauma hit him, and the fact that he thinks people need to own up to this to stay compassionate to do the work they do. Okay, that's the slides. Let me stop sharing. Okay, over to you guys. Did that make any sense at all? Thoughts, comments, problems or questions?
Really helpful, Robyn. Thank you. And I think there's some, I've written down some of the other resources and things that I'll share with everyone as well that you mentioned on the way through, which is
good. Yeah, rate the resources. That's really important.
Thank you. I love the phrase willfully grateful. I think that's
we have to. We're not grateful. Our brains are. Your brain would rather you unhappy and noticing the lion than relaxed and grateful and being eaten. Right. So we have a natural evolutionary bias. But actually gratitude is what keeps other people helping us and reminds us that we're not alone. So we just have to get over ourselves on that one. Yep. Okay. So are you all thinking of something you might do differently to look after yourself and each other? Yes, hopefully. And have a think about whether you want to go
Everyone's going on a holiday.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, one of the factors of COVID is that we haven't had that nothing to get away from it and get the change of scene, and that's added to the pressure in the last couple of years, obviously. But do cultivate the idea of brain holidays as well. If you get your brain completely absorbed in a good book, a good movie, great music, dance, martial arts, yoga, whatever, that's a brain holiday. That'll change the chemistry just as effectively as being physically away. So make sure they're happening on a regular basis. All right. So maybe you've got a conversation to start there about thinking about how you check in with each other, what kind of debriefing or diffusing you might want to look at, and just learning to ask each other the questions about how you're traveling and being prepared to answer honestly if you're not traveling so well. And leaders, can I urge you to be the first to put your hand up to go, that was really tough. I think I'll make an appointment with EAP, and tell people you have, and keep the appointment and go have it, and then come back and discuss any strategies that have been helpful that you feel you can with others. If leaders and senior people do it, then everyone else will do it. That's my challenge to you. All right. Any other final comments or questions? Have I covered everything I said I would, Luce?
I think so, definitely.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. Thank you. Apologies for the start, but thank you. There's so much. I think we just I'm speaking for myself, but taking in everything, and there's so much you've given us both on from the research, something for people who want to look at the research, great tips for the team, the conversation starters, and the practical things that you can do every day. So
cool. Cool. Yeah, no, I'm always completely relaxed when the technology stuff up is not my fault. So
yeah, me less so, but I feel a little bit calmer in how to deal with it now. So
it just happens as part of yes, just one of the things we have to go with the flow with. And remember, I said perfectionism is not a good thing. So, all right, well, thank you very much for having me, and look after yourselves and each other. And thanks again from me, very, very genuinely, for doing the work you do. It's so important, and be really proud of yourselves for doing that. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, Robyn.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Well, I agree with that.